Our question focuses on Christian identity. We explore how the shaping decision and internal conflicts within Christian parties, and how different interpretations of Christianity contribute to the collapse on coalition. Before we dive into the Dutch political crisis of 2025, let's set the scene. The governing coalition slowly collapsed that year, and understanding why requires looking at how identity shapes politics in the Netherlands. Okay, for this we use Sir Rogers Brubaker. He argues that in contemporary Europe, religion no longer functions mainly as personal belief or doctrine. Instead, it works as identity marker, a way for groups to define themselves and others. This process is called punctuatory work, drawing symbolic lines between who belongs and who doesn't. In this framework, Christianity becomes less about church attendance and more about representing a cultural tradition, a signal of moral order, history, and civilization. Punctuatory work is about designing who is part of us and who is part of them. These boundaries are not only about the faith, they mark a moral and cultural difference. Here, Christians signal a Western, liberal, secular heritage, and this identity can be mobilized in different political ways. Some parties used to frame Islam as a trade, while others use it as a moral humanitarian guide for ethics and foreign policy. Okay, this is key. Christian identity can be mobilized in very different ways. Civilization Christianity sets cultural boundaries, often framing Islam as a threat to European values. And moral humanitarian Christianity appeals to human dignity and ethical responsibility. This is campaigning from help use understand the collapse of the Dutch governing coalition in 2025. Parties were using the same word, Christianity, but pursuing entirely different political projects. With this framework, we can now look closely at the Dutch case and see how these competing identities created deep fault lines within the government.
So, before we look at why the coalition unraveled, it's important to understand who the four coalition parties were and where they stand ideologically. On this map, you can see the coalition stretch from center right all the way to the far right, which already signals potential tension. Starting on the center right, we have the New Social Contract, the NSC. This party is rooted in a Christian democratic ideological tradition, emphasizing moral responsibility, social ethics, and good governance. Moving further right is the VVD, the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy. The VVD is a conservative, liberal, economically right-wing party. It's basically pro-market, pro-business, and focused on economic stability rather than cultural issues. Next to the VVD is the BBB, the Farmer Citizen Movement. The BBB is an agrarian party aligned with the right-wing populism, and its politics revolve usually around rural identity, farmers' interests, and regional inequality. And finally, on the far right end of the spectrum, we have the PVV, the Party for Freedom, led by Gert Wilders. The PVV is a nationalist, anti-immigration populist party whose message centers on protecting Dutch and Western Christian cultural identity in opposition to Islam. So even though all four parties are technically on the right side of the spectrum, they do not share the same ideological foundation, and especially not the same understanding of Christian identity. The NSC's Christian identity is moral and ethical, while the PVV is cultural and civilizational. These differences are going to become crucial when we move to the policy conflicts that fractured the coalition. So now that we've seen where the four coalition parties sit on the right-left spectrum, we can explain how the coalition unraveled and why Christian identity played such a key role. So instead of a coalition collapsing twice, what happened instead was that it gradually fell apart in two major moments. The first break came in June of 2025 when the PVV left the coalition after failing to reach an agreement on immigration and asylum. For the PVV, immigration is not just a technical policy, it's tied to their cultural Christian identity narrative, which frames the Dutch nation as part of Western Christian civilization threatened by Islam. So when the coalition refused to adopt the stricter approach, which was essentially to ban immigration entirely, staying would have meant compromising their core ideological brand, so instead they walked out. After the PVV exit, the government immediately shifted into caretaker status, meaning it could continue functioning but without full authority of a normal cabinet. The second major break happened in August 2025, so only 2 months after PVV left the government, when the NSC also left the coalition, but for a completely different policy reason: the Israel-Gaza conflict. The foreign minister, Casper Veldkamp, pushed for sanctions against Israel on moral grounds, but could not gain support from the remaining coalition partners. So for the NSC, Christian identity is rooted not culturally but morally, in principles like dignity, responsibility, accountability in foreign affairs. So when these principles could not be defended inside the coalition, the NSC, like the PVV, chose to leave rather than detach themselves from the values it mobilizes voters around. So what remained after August was only the VVD and BBB in the caretaker government. But together they did not have enough parliamentary strength to pass any major policy or rebuild the coalition. So the only realistic strategy was to wait for November's elections, which happened recently, which we will elaborate on later. But the core takeaway essentially from this case background is that the 2025 coalition didn't fall because of leadership conflict or technical policy issues. It fell because of each party's Christian identity discourse defined what was non-negotiable: cultural identity for the PVV and moral identity for the NSC. When those values couldn't be defended within the government, both parties chose to exit over compromise, calculating that voters would reward ideological consistency in November. After looking at the background case, we will now focus on how the PVV and NSC mobilized Christian identity. So for the PVV, they mobilized Christian identity not as a religion but as a civilizational identity. In the Dutch context, populism often operates through what scholars call civilizationalism, and the PVV is the clearest example of this. Their discourse frames political conflict not in national terms but as a struggle between the Judeo-Christian humanist West and Islam. Brubaker describes this as using Christianity as a cultural and civilizational identity in response to a perceived Islamic threat. For Wilders, the Dutch and broader West are defined by a shared Judeo-Christian heritage, even though this has very little religious content. It's more about protecting a secular cultural tradition. So Christianity becomes a boundary marker, a way to draw a sharp line between who belongs to Dutch society and who threatens it. The civilizational identity creates a very clear us versus them dynamic. The us and PVV discourse are secular, ethnic Dutch people who may no longer believe in God but who see their liberal values as rooted in Judeo-Christian and humanist tradition. The them are Muslims, but also Dutch and European elites. Wilders regularly accuses these elites of allowing the destruction of Dutch and Western civilization. People feel that the state is failing to support vulnerable citizens while funding immigration. An important point is that the PVV doesn't actually attract religious Christians. Those voters tend to support the CDA or other Christian parties. So Christianity is used symbolically, a tool to form a broad civilizational in-group in contrast with Muslim communities and with left and center-right establishment parties. This civilizational framing is then used to mobilize national sentiments. Wilders often refers back to the Dutch Golden Age, a period of colonial expansion, artistic achievement, and scientific progress, as evidence of the superiority of Judeo-Christian civilization. Similarly, in a speech to Vox that we will show in a second, he referred to the Reconquista, framing it as another era when Christian Europe reclaimed itself from external threats. In both cases, these past movements serve as symbolic reminders of a supposedly stronger, more unified Western civilization that PVV claims must now be defended. Internationally, the PVV builds alliances with other movements that share the civilizational worldview. Wilders celebrated Trump's victory as part of a wider populist uprising and traveled to the US and Australia to connect with similar anti-Muslim Christian civilizationalist agendas. At the same time, Wilders is very careful to distance himself from fascist right-wing groups, insisting his movement is secular, socially liberal, and fundamentally different from figures like Jean Le Pen and Haider. Ultimately, the PVV's goal isn't a return to religious politics, but a stronger Dutch nationalism. Civilizational Christianity is a strategic tool. It merges Christian heritage with secular values to define who is really Dutch and to rally voters against outsiders and elites. To close this section, I want to show how the civilizational discourse actually sounds in practice. These clips show Wilders using civilizational language in real time in a speech to Vox, and Dr. Cohen Vossen highlights why the PVV is essentially a one-man party built around a strong anti-Islam core. So Christian identity becomes a cultural tool to define who belongs.
Are great admirers of Spain. Spanish courage, tenacity and persistence saved Western civilization. You were the first. Spain was the first who made his nation great again. I myself have been living under Islamic fatwas and death threats and 24/7 police protection for over 2 decades now, only for speaking the truth about Islam. In Europe, we will never forget. The violent knights of the Reconquista were the first to turn the tide of history. You were the first who rolled back Islam and restored the rich heritage of Christianity in your country.
I think it is anti-Islam core is absolutely the most important core of this party. I say party, but no, the thing is with the PVV, it's really basically one man. Although he has
The new social contract is another prime case of how Dutch political parties mobilize civilizational Christianity. The new social contract does not present itself as a church party, but rather as a movement rooted in Catholic social thought, defining their key values as solidarity, responsibility, stewardship, and the importance of family and community in a recognizably Christian moral tradition. By doing so, they appeal to voters who value Christian democratic moral traditions while remaining a non confessional party. They achieve this by framing their politics as a new moral covenant, grounded in fairness, trust, and mutual responsibility. Through populist rhetoric such as describing Dutch society as spiritually empty and in need of stewardship and solidarity, the new social contract resonates emotionally with voters who may not be religious but who identify with the Netherlands' Christian heritage and wish to protect it. In doing so, the new social contract uses Christianity as a civilizational identity marker, consistent with Brubaker's theory. In this sense, Christianity becomes less about a religious doctrine and more about a shared moral cultural heritage, a symbolic boundary of who we are as a society. The new social contract, through the language of solidarity, sets these boundaries on who belongs. These boundaries work quietly to shape policy areas such as migration, as seen through the new social contract advocating to cap net migration to 50,000 a year, and proposing to reduce expat benefits and international study programs, justifying their policies not only in economic terms, but through the idea of protecting social cohesion and cultural continuity. As Brubaker suggests, the new social contract mobilizes Christianity both as a moral framework and as a cultural identity, allowing it to appeal broadly across the centre-right, while still maintaining the language of humanitarian duty. This dual use strengthens the party reach, but as we've noted earlier, it also creates tensions, since the humanitarian and civilization logics do not always pull in the same directions.
Let's conclude with the key takeaways. First, Christianity still matters in Europe not as personal faith, but as identity marker. Following Brubaker, religion can act as symbol boundary work, drawing lines between us and them. In Dutch case, the coalition crisis showed how competing interpretation for Christianity identity, civilizational versus moral humanitarian, can clash and create instability. The PVV and NEC parties demonstrate that rigid cultural and moral stance can override practical coalition building. The step-by-step collapse on the coalition wasn't about religion versus secularism, but about coalition's inability to accommodate to incompatible Christian identity. Projects over time, first cultural nationalism, then moral humanitarian. Additionally, sensitive issues like Israel and Gaza or immigration show that you can place ideology about the stability of your government. Polarization pushes the coalition to an extreme point. This case reminds us that the prioritizing ideology over compromise can produce serious governance challenges across Europe.